When my sister got married, I kept quiet about the $17.3 million I had just inherited from our parents, and thank God I did, because only days later they walked back into our lives with a notary, and the whole room froze in shock. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your family, the one who swallows her pride while everyone else takes the spotlight, then you know exactly why I'm sharing this. And before I go any further, let me just say, if you've ever been in that position, please hit the like button or leave a comment, because your support means more than you realize. It's what keeps stories like this alive. I'm Monica, 34 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been treated like the quiet shadow in the family. My younger sister Victoria has always been the star, the one everyone gushed over, the one with the pretty hair, the perfect smile, the golden path ahead of her. Meanwhile, I was the dependable one, the background character, the one who made sure errands got done, who smiled through the jokes made at her expense, and who was always expected to be grateful just for being included. On her wedding day, they sat me so close to the kitchen that one of the waiters actually tried to hand me a tray of appetizers. For a second, I almost took it. Maybe if I played waitress, people would finally look at me. The cruelest part was that hours before that wedding, I had learned something that could have flipped the entire script. I was the sole heir to my parents' estate. Not just a modest inheritance, but $17.3 million. The kind of money that could buy the venue, the band, the dress, and still leave enough to retire twice over. And yet, I didn't breathe a word. Why? Because as much as I wanted to scream it in their smug faces, I couldn't bring myself to ruin her wedding day. I told myself silence was strength. I told myself keeping the peace was the right thing. So I smoothed out my thrift store dress, ignored the champagne flutes rattling on the tray by my side, and pretended I was just another guest. But silence comes at a cost. The maid of honor's speech painted Victoria as the sister who deserved every blessing in life. And then, like a bad punchline, she added, and Monica, who's just happy to tag along. The room erupted in laughter, glasses clinked, and someone even shouted, "At least she brought a smile." I laughed too, but it felt like my face might crack from the pressure. My uncle leaned across the table and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Your turn will come. Maybe when pigs fly." I wanted to pour my drink right in his lap. Instead, I forced a smile so tight it made my jaw ache. And then the groom delivered his toast, the crown jewel of humiliation. With his arm draped around my sister, he said, "I married the golden girl, the one with the brains, the beauty, and the future. And Monica, well, she's proof that every family needs someone to make the rest of us look good." The laughter this time was louder, harsher, echoing through the hall like a cruel chorus. I clenched my hands under the table until my nails left marks in my palms. I laughed on cue like the good little sister I'd always been, but inside, a storm was building. That was the moment I promised myself one thing: they would not laugh forever. The night dragged on, and the more champagne flowed, the bolder people became with their little jabs at me. It was like I had been cast as the evening's entertainment, the punchline everyone could take turns throwing at. A cousin I hadn't seen in years leaned in and asked if I had finally found a real job, then laughed before I could even answer. Another relative squinted at my dress and whispered, not nearly quiet enough, "Is that from Goodwill?" I wanted to turn and say, "Yes, and it cost me $10 less than your personality." But instead, I swallowed the words with another forced smile. Victoria played her role as the queen of the night perfectly. She floated around the ballroom with her new husband on her arm, glowing in that smug, untouchable way she always had. But she couldn't resist circling back to me, like a cat that enjoys toying with its prey. At one point, she stopped in front of my table, tilted her head, and said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Don't worry, Monica. One day someone might love you enough to rent a church basement." The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, the kind that makes your stomach twist. I laughed too, though mine came out so flat it could have been mistaken for a cough. Inside, though, I felt that storm grow stronger. The groom, meanwhile, seemed to take actual delight in joining the chorus. At the buffet line, he leaned toward me and whispered, "Don't load up too much, Monica. Some of us still have to fit into our clothes tomorrow." His smirk was so smug I nearly lost it right there. I wanted to snap back, tell him I could buy and sell him 10 times over if I wanted, but instead I grabbed an extra slice of cake just to spite him. Humor is a survival mechanism after all, and in that moment, the only thing that kept me from screaming was the thought that one day, one way or another, they'd choke on their own words. The worst moment came when the DJ called for the sisters dance. Everyone expected me to join Victoria on the floor, but as soon as I stepped out, she leaned into the microphone and said, "Careful, everyone. Monica hasn't danced since middle school. Don't expect miracles." People laughed, phones came out, and someone even shouted, "Give us a show!" I stood there, frozen under the spotlight, praying for the floor to swallow me. I tried to laugh it off, muttered something about rusty moves, but inside I was dying. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was orchestrated, and the worst part was knowing they all thought I was too weak to fight back. As I sat back down, my aunt patted my hand and whispered, "Honey, you really should learn to take a joke." I wanted to tell her that being laughed at for existing wasn't a joke, but I stayed silent. Again. But this time, that silence didn't feel like strength. It felt like fuel, piling higher and higher, waiting for the right spark. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My sister had no idea what she had set in motion. The wedding eventually ended, though not before every ounce of my patience had been tested. And when I finally slipped away from the noise and the clinking glasses, I felt like I could breathe again. But the universe clearly wasn't finished with me yet, because waiting back at my apartment was a thin, weathered envelope with my name written in my father's familiar script, a handwriting I hadn't seen in years. And when I saw it lying on the floor just inside the door, my whole body went cold. I tore it open with trembling hands, half afraid it was some cruel joke. But inside was a single folded page that mentioned the inheritance not as a final gift, but as the beginning of something larger, a responsibility that carried conditions no one else knew about, and the words were just vague enough to make me both anxious and curious. It was as if my parents had left me a riddle, one that promised I was holding only a piece of the truth, and the rest was waiting to be uncovered. I read the page over and over, my mind racing, and each time it felt heavier, like it wasn't just paper, but a key. The kind that could open a door to secrets nobody else in my family even suspected existed. And suddenly, my silence at the wedding didn't feel like weakness anymore. It felt like a strategy I hadn't even realized I was choosing, because now I had proof there was more to the story than a check with too many zeros. I thought about what it could mean, whether it was another account, another property, or something more intangible, like a family trust or a hidden clause. And the very possibility filled me with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation, the kind of jittery energy that keeps you awake long after you should be sleeping. The next day I carried the letter everywhere I went, folded neatly in my purse like a secret weapon. And when Victoria called me just to brag about the most magical honeymoon of all time, I bit my tongue again, listening to her go on about beachfront dinners and champagne breakfasts. But this time, my silence felt different, almost powerful, because I knew something she didn't, something that could turn her perfect little world upside down. At one point, she even asked me if I had found a +1 to occupy myself with while she was away, and I nearly laughed out loud at the thought that, while she was busy mocking me, I was busy holding the kind of secret that could stop her cold. Still, the weight of the letter pressed on me like a hand at my back, pushing me toward answers, and though I had no idea where to begin, I knew I couldn't just sit on this forever, because the words were too deliberate, too carefully chosen, like breadcrumbs leading me somewhere my parents had wanted me to go. The irony was almost funny. They had spent years making me feel invisible, And now, even from beyond the grave, they had trusted me with something that clearly mattered more than anyone in my family realized. For the first time in a long time, I felt something like hope flicker inside me. Not because I had money, but because I had a purpose. And that was the spark I didn't know I had been waiting for. The more I turned the letter over in my mind, the clearer it became that silence was not just survival anymore. It was a shield. Because the moment my sister or her new husband learned what I held in my purse, the claws would come out and I would be shredded to pieces before I even had time to defend myself. So instead, I made the decision to play the part they had already assigned me. The quiet shadow, the harmless extra, the woman nobody ever took seriously, while behind the curtain, I would begin piecing together the truth my parents had hidden. I told myself that as long as I wore their mask of invisibility, I could move freely, unnoticed, and that was a power I had never realized I could use. The first step was to look closely at the details I had overlooked before, and when I combed through the rest of the documents my parents' lawyer had mailed me, I noticed small notations, initials, dates that seemed random until I lined them up, and suddenly a pattern appeared. A trail that hinted at accounts and properties far beyond the inheritance check I had already deposited. I knew enough to realize this wasn't clumsiness. This was intention, the kind of subtle breadcrumb trail left by people who didn't trust everyone around them, and for the first time I wondered if my parents had known all along that Victoria would betray them if given the chance. The thought was both chilling and strangely comforting, because it meant my silence wasn't cowardice. It was exactly what they had counted on. Meanwhile, Victoria and her husband carried on with their honeymoon fantasy, posting endless photos of themselves clinking glasses in front of sunsets, captions about forever love and power couples. And though I smiled politely when relatives forwarded me the pictures, inside I kept a running list of their arrogance, filing each one away like evidence for a case that hadn't yet gone to trial. They believed they had won, that I would always be the quiet background, but I started to realize I was building something they couldn't see, a private arsenal of knowledge and proof that would one day matter more than any staged photograph on social media. I still didn't know exactly what my parents had intended, but with every note I deciphered and every late-night call I made to the old family lawyer's office, I felt the weight of the inheritance shift from burden to weapon, and the longer I stayed silent, the sharper that weapon became. For years they had laughed at me, treated me like a joke, and maybe I had played along because it was easier than fighting, but now I was finally learning the power of waiting, of holding the cards close to my chest until the perfect moment came to lay them down, and I could almost taste the day when the laughter would stop and every smirk would die on their lips. It was only a few days after the wedding when the impossible happened, the kind of moment you don't believe even as you are living it, because just as I was sitting at home replaying the humiliation over and over in my head, the sound of tires crunching against the gravel outside pulled me to the window, and there it was, a sleek black Lincoln pulling up in front of my modest apartment like it had no business being in my neighborhood. I watched, frozen, as the doors opened one after another, and then my heart slammed against my ribs because stepping out of the car was not some stranger, not some delivery, but my parents. The same parents everyone had mourned years ago, the same parents I had convinced myself I'd never see again. They were alive, standing there with solemn expressions, and beside them, a sharply dressed man carrying a leather briefcase that could only belong to a notary. I stumbled to the door, my legs barely holding me up, and when I opened it, they looked at me with eyes that carried both recognition and a strange distance, like they had aged in secret years I hadn't shared. My throat closed as 100 questions burned inside me, but before I could speak, the notary adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his presence steady, businesslike, almost out of place against the raw emotion bubbling in the air. I ushered them inside, still trembling, and as the door shut behind us, I realized the world I thought I knew had just cracked wide open. Everything I had believed about inheritance, about death, about family duty, had just been rewritten in the span of a single knock at the door. The strangest part was how calm they seemed, as if walking back into my life after years of silence and presumed death was nothing more than returning from a long trip. And though I wanted to scream and demand answers, I felt myself slip back into the same role I had always played, the quiet observer, the one who listens before she speaks. But this time, something was different, because I wasn't just listening to family gossip or enduring a cruel joke at a wedding. I was standing at the center of a storm I hadn't asked for, holding a secret inheritance, a suspicious letter, and now facing parents who should have been in the ground but were instead in my living room with legal papers that promised even more revelations. For the first time in years, the silence I carried didn't feel like weakness or submission. It felt like the sharp inhale before an explosion, the moment just before thunder cracks and lightning shatters the sky. I didn't know why they had disappeared. I didn't know why they had chosen this moment to return, and I didn't know what exactly they expected of me. But I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Nothing in my life, or Victoria's, or anyone else's, would ever be the same again. The notary wasted no time with pleasantries, instead laying his briefcase on my kitchen table with the kind of precision you only see in courtrooms. And as he clicked open the locks and pulled out a thick folder, I felt my stomach twist into knots, because suddenly this wasn't just a strange family reunion. It was an ambush of truth waiting to detonate. My parents sat across from me, calm and unreadable, while the notary adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud in a voice that filled every corner of the room, a voice that left no space for denial. The will, he explained, had clauses none of us had known, hidden conditions that made the original $17.3 million seem like just the surface of something far deeper. I gripped the edge of the table as he read, because each sentence felt like a stone dropping into water, sending ripples that spread further and further. The clause was simple and brutal. The inheritance had been left solely in my name, not out of favoritism, but out of trust. A trust built on the belief that I alone had shown restraint, patience, and honesty when the rest of the family had chosen shortcuts and selfishness. It wasn't just money, it was a test, one I hadn't even known I was taking, and somehow I had passed. My chest burned as I realized that every time I had stayed silent, every time I had bitten my tongue and endured, I had been proving myself worthy in ways I hadn't understood. And now, with my parents sitting only a few feet away, the truth was undeniable. Victoria had never been the golden child. I had been the quiet cornerstone all along. The notary paused only once, long enough to slide a second sealed envelope across the table toward me, explaining that inside were documents that detailed additional accounts and properties tied to the inheritance, and that only my signature could unlock them. Victoria's name wasn't mentioned once. The air seemed to thicken as the reality settled in, because though she wasn't in the room yet, I could already picture the moment she learned the truth, the exact second when the smug smile would vanish from her face. I imagined her perfect posture crumbling, the whispers starting among her friends, the fiancé who had married her for a future that no longer existed. I sat there in silence, nodding slowly, my mind racing, because I understood something important in that instant. My silence had become my greatest weapon, sharper than any insult, heavier than any toast made at my expense. And now, with my parents back from the shadows and the law on my side, I was holding a ticking bomb that would change everything once I chose to drop it. The humiliation I had endured at her wedding suddenly felt small, almost laughable, compared to the devastation waiting just around the corner. And though I said nothing, I felt my lips curve into the faintest smile. When the notary finished, The silence in the room was so heavy I could hear the faint ticking of the old clock on my wall, and for a long moment none of us moved, as if we were suspended in some strange in-between world where the dead had returned and the living were finally unmasked. Then my father leaned forward, his face stern but not unkind, and began to speak in a low, steady voice that carried the weight of years spent in hiding. He explained that their disappearance had not been an accident, nor was it some tragic twist of fate, as we had all believed. It had been deliberate, a choice made after discovering that Victoria had been helping people outside the family siphon off assets, signing papers she barely understood in exchange for the promise of status and luxury. He said they had seen enough betrayal in their lives to know that one more act of treachery could cost them everything, so they vanished, leaving behind the illusion of death, trusting that someday the truth would come full circle. My hands shook as I listened, not from fear, but from the strange relief of finally hearing aloud what I'd always felt but could never prove, that the golden image of my sister had been a carefully polished lie, a mask covering greed and selfishness that everyone had chosen to ignore because it was prettier to believe in her shine than to look deeper. My mother's eyes were sharp as she added that Victoria's arrogance had only grown worse with time, that she had mocked even them when they warned her of consequences, insisting that she deserved more than what life had given. I sat there, my throat tight, realizing how every cruel laugh at that wedding, every smug insult at my expense, had been nothing but the surface of a much darker truth. And suddenly the humiliation I had suffered didn't feel random anymore. It was the arrogance of someone who thought she would never be caught. The notary opened another folder then, producing copies of documents with Victoria's signature sprawled across them, proof of the betrayal etched in black ink, undeniable even to the most loyal admirer. I stared at those signatures, bold loops and flourishes that she had always been so proud of, the kind she would practice as a teenager because she said her name deserved to look important. Now they were the very evidence that condemned her, and I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh under my breath, because the irony was too sharp to ignore. Her handwriting had finally made her important, just not in the way she wanted. It was the kind of cruel twist you'd expect from a fable, and in that moment I felt the tiniest spark of justice flicker inside me, though I kept my expression calm and unreadable, knowing that silence was still my shield. What struck me most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the way my parents and the notary laid it out, with such careful precision, making sure that when this truth finally reached Victoria, and it inevitably would, there would be no way to twist or deny it. They weren't just telling me a secret, they were building a case, constructing a fortress of evidence around me so that when the storm came, I would stand firm while she crumbled. For years, I had thought of myself as the invisible one, the quiet one, the woman laughed at in thrift store dresses and shoved to the edges of family photos. But now I saw myself differently, not as weak, but as chosen, the one who had been trusted to carry the truth because I had never betrayed it. And though the thought scared me, it also thrilled me, because I knew the day was coming when the laughter would stop and the world would finally see who Victoria really was. It didn't take long for the truth to spill into the open, because in families like ours, secrets don't stay buried. They claw their way to the surface like weeds breaking through concrete, and within days, Victoria was summoned to a family gathering she assumed was going to be another chance for her to bask in attention. Instead, she walked into a room heavy with silence, my parents seated at the head of the long dining table, the notary's papers stacked neatly in front of them like weapons waiting to be fired. I sat off to the side, quiet as always, but this time not weak, this time holding back a storm I knew would finally be unleashed. When the documents were laid out and her signature stared back at her from every page, The color drained from her face so fast it was almost comical, like watching makeup wash away in a sudden rain. Her new husband was the first to break the silence, and his voice wasn't filled with loyalty or love, but with raw, selfish anger, demanding to know why she hadn't told him, why she had hidden the truth, why she had let him walk into a marriage thinking he was securing a future built on wealth and prestige, when all along she had been standing on quicksand. The room erupted into whispers, cousins covering their mouths, aunts shaking their heads, and Victoria, usually so polished, so perfectly in control, began stammering excuses that sounded weaker with every word. She blamed misunderstandings. She blamed confusion. She even tried to turn her tears into weapons, but nothing could drown out the mountain of evidence stacked against her. Watching her unravel was like seeing a statue crack from the inside, the flawless surface splintering until it collapsed under its own weight. The moment that sealed her downfall came when her husband stood up, ripped off his wedding ring, and tossed it onto the table in front of her, the sound of the metal hitting the wood sharper than any slap. He told her he hadn't signed up to be the fool, that he wasn't going to chain himself to someone whose crown had turned to dust overnight. And without another glance, he stormed out of the room, leaving her standing alone in her perfect white dress, suddenly looking more like a costume than a triumph. The whispers turned into open chatter now, guests shaking their heads, some even laughing quietly, because nothing spreads faster than the fall of someone who had once strutted like a queen. And though I had been humiliated on her wedding day, though I had been forced to smile through tears and insults, now it was her turn to taste the bitter edge of public shame. I sat still, my heart pounding but my face calm, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the shadow. I felt like the storm. She tried to look at me, her eyes wide and desperate, as if begging me to step in, to save her, to share the burden. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't offer her the lifeline she had never once offered me. And in that silence, louder than any speech I could have made, I gave her the answer she had earned. Nothing. The humiliation was hers now, and as she crumbled under the weight of her ruined marriage, her shattered image, and the cold truth of her betrayal, I realized that justice doesn't always come in fiery outbursts or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it comes in the quiet, when the one who is always invisible finally watches the mask of the golden child fall to pieces in front of everyone. For most of my life, my role had been to sit quietly at the edge of the room while others performed their dramas in the spotlight. But as I watched Victoria crumble, her perfect facade collapsing under the weight of betrayal and shame, I realized the silence I had carried was no longer a cage but a weapon, and now was the time to use it. The room, still buzzing with whispers after her husband's stormy exit, seemed to tilt toward me, waiting to see if I would stay in my usual place or finally step forward. My heart hammered in my chest, but I rose to my feet, smoothing the skirt of my simple dress, as if that single gesture was enough to steady me. And when I lifted my chin, I felt a strength I hadn't known was mine, a strength born not from being loud, but from enduring and watching until the moment was right. I walked to the head of the table, every eye following, and for once there was no laughter, no smirk, no whispered insult, just the sharp silence of people realizing the balance of power had shifted. My parents' eyes met mine, and though they said nothing, I could see in their gaze that this was what they had been waiting for, the moment when the quiet daughter they had trusted would stand on her own. I placed my hand on the stack of documents, steady and deliberate, and spoke not with fury or vengeance, but with calm certainty, explaining that I had remained silent not because I was weak, but because strength sometimes means knowing when to wait, when to hold back, when to let the truth speak louder than anger ever could. Victoria tried to interrupt, her voice shaking, insisting that I had always been jealous, that this was some twisted revenge, but her words fell flat, bouncing off the walls with none of the power they once held. The guests didn't rally to her side, they didn't laugh with her or clap in support. They sat frozen, their faces tight with the uncomfortable recognition that the golden child had been nothing but fool's gold all along. I turned toward her slowly, meeting her eyes, and for the first time in our lives, she looked smaller than me, diminished not by my cruelty, but by her own. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My silence had already said everything. When I finally stepped back, the air felt different, charged in a way I had never experienced, because for the first time the family didn't see me as the background character or the shadow. They saw me as the anchor, the one who had stood steady when everyone else played games and chased illusions. I realized then that I hadn't just inherited money. I had inherited the right to my own voice, my own power, my own story, and there was no going back to the way things had been. The laughter that once cut me now belonged to me, because I knew the next time anyone dared to mock, it would sound hollow, a memory of a past that had already died. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't living in the shadow of someone else's story. I was finally living in my own. And though it felt strange at first to walk into a room and have every eye turned toward me with respect rather than pity or ridicule, I quickly realized this was what it meant to be free of the invisible chains I had worn for so long. My parents guided me carefully through the mountain of responsibilities that came with the inheritance, the properties tucked away in small towns, the accounts spread across banks, the trusts established decades earlier. But what struck me most wasn't the sheer size of it all. It was the intentionality, the way every choice they had made pointed back to one thing: trust. They had trusted me, not because I was the loudest or the most charming, but because I had endured, because I had been steady when everyone else had wavered, and that realization was worth more than any check with a dozen zeros. What changed most wasn't my bank account, though. It was the way people treated me. Relatives who once snickered behind their glasses at family gatherings now went quiet when I entered the room, some even stumbling over apologies that felt awkward on their tongues. And though I didn't need their words, I let them speak, not because I craved their regret, but because I wanted them to hear themselves admitting out loud what they had ignored for so long. Old friends who had drifted away suddenly found excuses to call. Neighbors who once overlooked me now offered warm smiles, and the same aunt who once told me to learn to take a joke brought over a homemade pie as if pastry could patch years of cruelty. I accepted it all with grace, not because I had forgotten, but because I no longer needed their validation. The power of surviving silence had already taught me more than their praise ever could. Victoria, by contrast, seemed to shrink with every passing day. The woman who had once strutted through rooms like a queen now avoided eye contact, her posture bent under the weight of whispers she could no longer control, her laughter gone, replaced by sharp silences and sudden outbursts that only made people pull further away. Her husband's departure had been the first blow, but it was the steady erosion of her reputation that truly broke her, because without an audience, without admiration, she had nothing left. I didn't gloat when I saw her standing alone at a family function, her eyes rimmed red, her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself yet again to people who had already stopped listening. But I won't lie. There was a sharp satisfaction in seeing karma do what I could never have orchestrated myself. She had mocked me for years, and now she had become the punchline, not in private whispers, but in the open space of a family that finally saw her truth. My parents reminded me often that wealth has a way of corrupting even the strongest, that it whispers lies into ears hungry for more, and they warned me not to become what I had despised. Their words hit deep, because I knew how easy it could be to turn arrogance into armor, to let pride fill the cracks that pain had left behind, and I made myself a promise then and there that I would not waste the second chance I had been given. The inheritance wasn't just money, It was a test of character, one I had already passed once by staying silent, and now I needed to pass it again by living with integrity. I realized the true gift wasn't $17.3 million. It was the strength of knowing who I was when everything else had been stripped away. At night, lying in bed, I sometimes replayed the wedding in my mind. The laughter, the cruel toasts, the way they all looked at me like I was nothing. And instead of crying the way I once did, I found myself smiling. Because I knew something they hadn't known then. Every cruel word, every joke at my expense, every smirk had been fuel, building the fire that carried me through humiliation to victory. They thought they were breaking me down, but all along they were sharpening me, and in the end it was their own arrogance that destroyed them. Peace, I realized, isn't the absence of pain, it's the quiet strength of surviving it. And in that strength, I had found myself at last. Looking back now, I often ask myself what might have happened if I had opened my mouth at that wedding, if I had let the words pour out and told everyone about the inheritance, if I had watched the perfect little stage crumble that very night. Maybe people would have gasped. Maybe the groom would have dropped his champagne glass. Maybe Victoria's crown would have slipped right there under the chandeliers. But as tempting as that fantasy is, I know deep down it would never have brought the same satisfaction I feel now, because silence turned out to be my greatest weapon. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't cowardice. It was patience sharpened into steel, a shield that kept me steady until karma could land the blow for me. My sister believed the world would always worship her shine, but crowns made of vanity don't survive storms, and hers cracked the moment truth was dragged into the light. Watching her unravel piece by piece was like watching a movie in reverse. The golden girl fading back into someone plain, someone desperate, someone stripped of all the illusions she had worn like armor. She lost her husband in a single night, not because of me, but because truth has a way of cutting deeper than betrayal itself. She lost her reputation, because once people see behind the mask, they can never unsee it, and no amount of smiles or apologies can glue it back together. And she lost the admiration she had fed on her entire life, because when whispers turn against you, when laughter becomes directed at you instead of with you, it's over. What she has left now are empty rooms, unanswered calls, and a name that once commanded attention, but now only triggers pity. And I don't gloat over it, not exactly, but there is a justice in it that even I can't deny. For me, life finally feels like it belongs to me. I'm no longer the quiet sister shoved to the back of the family photos, no longer the punchline at parties or the one seated near the kitchen doors while everyone else basks in the center. I am no longer invisible. I carry myself differently now, not because of the money, but because I understand the power of waiting, of refusing to let cruelty define you, of trusting that truth always finds a way. People look at me now with a mixture of respect and curiosity, and I can tell they're still adjusting to this version of Monica, the one who no longer bows her head or laughs at jokes made at her expense. And maybe that's the sweetest part. Not the inheritance, not the documents, not the properties, but the freedom of knowing I no longer need to prove my worth to anyone. The irony of it all is that Victoria used to mock me for being quiet. She used to say silence made me weak, but in the end it was her noise that destroyed her. The endless bragging, the arrogance, the loudness of someone who believed the spotlight would never burn out. My silence was my survival, and eventually my silence became her undoing. I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't delivered in fiery speeches or dramatic outbursts, but in the quiet patience of letting time do what anger cannot. And when the moment finally comes, when truth arrives carrying a notary's stamp and a stack of papers, it doesn't just sting, it dismantles everything the liar built, brick by brick. Now, when people ask me what lesson I take from all this, I keep it simple because the truth doesn't need embellishment. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because silence doesn't mean weakness. It means they are listening, they are watching, they are waiting. And when they finally speak, or act, it will be at the moment that matters most. My sister underestimated me. She underestimated silence itself, and that mistake cost her everything she thought she couldn't lose. Justice didn't come to me because I chased it. It came because I let it arrive on its own terms, and when it did, it was unstoppable. And maybe that's the moral I want to leave with you. Don't mock the people who seem invisible, because invisibility is not emptiness, it's potential. And one day, the quiet one you laughed at may hold the key to your downfall. My story proves that justice doesn't always thunder in loudly. Sometimes it creeps in softly, with folded papers and steady signatures, and by the time it settles, the damage is already done. And to you listening now, thank you for sharing this journey with me. Thank you for walking through my storm and staying until the calm arrived. Your support means more than I can ever say, and if this story touched you, please leave a comment, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because it reminds me every day that I am not invisible anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that is the sweetest justice of all.